Myriam, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
It's a real pleasure. We've had the chance to share the same panel a couple of months ago, and I was blown away by how much knowledge you store in your head, and the area in which you specialize in. I don't think is an area from an academic perspective we study enough. There's so much to be said about it. But let's start at the start. How did you end up being a specialist in gender economics?
Yeah, and it's a good question because actually gender is really generally not associated with the field of economics. And so maybe just to go a bit backwards, what attracted me to economics was not actually economics. What I wanted to do is I wanted to work in international development and I wanted to do sociology. But in France, sociology is associated with la voie poubelle because, everybody goes there, it's a high failure rate. So my parents, a bit like Mauritian parents, pushed me into doing economics. But when I was doing economics, what I really liked were subdisciplines that looked at trying to understand what led to unequal distribution of resources. So I liked political economy, I liked development economics, labor economics that looked at labor market outcomes, microeconomics of poverty alleviation. So these were the kind of topics that I was always attracted or liked or enjoyed when I was doing economics. And that led me to do a master's in development economics in Manchester in the UK. And in that master's, they had a module called gender economics. And I had never heard of it before, and it startled me. I actually went to see with Barbara Evers, who was a professor of that module, and I said, well, can you tell me about the module? And I said, I want to do this. But then she told me, you're the only one. So she told me, I will run the module if you can find other students to join. And so I actually went to look
with your little paper
trying to convince anyone in my cohort to actually do that module. But that was a cohort. I think we were a cohort of 40, and there were maybe 10 girls, 10 women, 10 young women, and mostly were men. And I managed to convince one of them to come and do the gender economics with me. And Barbara accepted. She said, okay, I will do the module. And the department, I guess, accepted. And I will do that one module for these two students. And for me, that module was an eye-opener. And it was an eye-opener for two different reasons. First, as an economist, suddenly I had a subdiscipline that provided me with a framework that allowed me to make sense of a lot of things which I thought were problematic in economics in terms of the assumptions that we made about economic agents, this rational economic man that could make rational decisions with independent preferences. Suddenly I had a framework that allowed me to look at it critically and understand that we could actually conceive economics differently. That actually there was space for what we call non-independent preference, where you make choices not just depending on you, but also dependent on the preferences of others, which is much more relatable to the experiences of female economic agents, at least how we understand it in the discipline. It also questioned the hegemony of the neoclassical school of thought in economics and this obsession with hard science investigation. Economics is a very quantitative discipline. It's very good, it's important, but the problem with having a purely quantitative discipline is that it doesn't allow us to understand norms, culture, and all these processes that lead to unequal resource allocation. And resource allocation is at the core of economics as a discipline, and well-being is at the core of economics as a discipline. And if we don't have frameworks to understand these processes, these norms, these cultures, these structures, then a whole part of economics and how it functions is missing in the discipline. And so feminist economics or gender economics suddenly provided me with tools to understand the economic world with more complexity and allowed me to answer questions that I felt traditional economics could not answer. And of course, the other reason why for me it was an eye-opener is because suddenly I was in a discipline where we're discussing things that I could relate to as a young woman living in a society that was still a carrier of a lot of biases. And it allowed me to understand some of my own experiences or things I could observe in the world around me. For example, the social expectation that women should be looking after the care economy, the fact that gender attributes are not biological attributes but socially constructed. So all these things for me were a module was suddenly, there was no going back after that module.
Really? Was your teacher, was Barbara an expert on the subject already?
Yes, so she came from an NGO world. She had worked in international development, and in international organization, gender is at the heart of any of their actions. And she did a PhD after many years of working in the international development world. And she did her PhD on actually macro and gender issues, macroeconomic and gender, so how to bring gender into macroeconomic theory. So yes, so the course was based on her expertise, but she was one of the first few economists to actually bring gender into the discipline, with others such as Maria Floro, Diane Nelson, etc. And but it was after that, I mean, it's actually gender that brought me to Mauritius as well, because I did my master's dissertation on the feminization of the labor force in Mauritius during the export processing zone and looking at the impact on the care economy. And then my PhD was a continuation of that. I got a scholarship and I continued my research in the field.
And the rest is history.
And the rest is history.
But did you feel then, when you were studying, so when you took that module in Manchester, did you even feel then that there were huge structural issues in society? I mean, now we're talking more about gender than we did 20 years ago.
No, when I took the module, I mean, I knew there were structures because, within economics, and especially within development economics, we know that structures are a very important factor to take into consideration for economic processes generally. So as a discipline, let's say theoretically I knew that it was relevant. But I think what was interesting for me is that actually at an individual level, I had never really thought about it. And I think that's why suddenly I could put words on things that, it's like, you're aware of something at the back of your mind, but you never take the time to articulate it into a conversation. And so, suddenly I could put words on things that I had never really took the time to pause and think about. But in terms of the discipline, yes, for me it was a continuity of something that made sense.
Sure. When you look at your parcours, so you spent a lot of time in England, some time in the UAE, a lot of time in Mauritius, and I just learned some time in Canada as well. How many lives have you had? And you grew up in France, exactly. So 4, very different societies and cultural way of doing things. So in terms of your practical experience, how would you summarize kind of gender politics, gender economics in these 4 different societies?
I mean, these are 3 different geographies with different pathways and different histories and different political structures. I mean, in the UK, of course, conversations around gender, had been taking place for hundreds of years and more proactively since the 60s, 70s. And so there are a lot of things that you take for granted and they're already entrenched as, the right of work. I mean, you don't even question it. I finished my degree, I got a job, and never even questioned the fact that I would not work, and nobody around me would question the fact that, whether or not I should or should not work.
Yes.
But having said that, I still felt that, there were structures which still prevented me to grow a career the same way as a man would, and in particular the maternity penalty, the fact that I was benefiting from a very generous, the higher education system in the UK is great. I got a 1-year maternal parental leave for my children, but it still required me to take a break in my career, to take a cut in my salary, to stop contributing to my pension fund. And you could say, okay, well, that was my choice, but that's a choice that my husband never had to make. And so I had to make choices that had huge impact in the most formative years of my career, when I was trying to become an established researcher, publishing article, but that you lose it. I mean, once you've taken 2-3 years break and you come back, you lose this formative year and you have to kind of restart from scratch. And that was quite painful for me because and again, this, but it's until you live it that you realize that there's really something that is profoundly unfair in that process. So yes, in the UK, things are, or France, you could think, okay, a lot of things have been achieved and attained, and in terms of legislation, etc. But actually, in terms of the structures, in terms of the social expectation that is put on women, not much has changed. And during COVID, a lot of women felt they were back in the 1950s. So I think,
cook, clean, look after the kids, the homeschooling plus your career.
Exactly. And so I think there's still a long way to go. The UAE was fascinating, and it was really interesting because I was working for a federal university, so I only had Emirati young women who were all Emiratis, and these were women who were evolving in very, very traditional societies, but in a context where the state, which is an autocratic state, practiced what you could call, state-sponsored feminism. And so, what the UAE would do is that they would decide the spaces that would that we would open to women. And so, for example, the UAE was, at least at the time, had a very strong Emiratization of the labor force policy, because they had a big issue that Emiratis were not working. And so at the heart of this policy was the need for women and young girls to be educated and to work. So in terms of access to education, in terms of access to employment, in terms of access to health, the Emirati government was extremely active and aggressive in ensuring that women had a greater place within these spheres. But they never, ever challenged the patriarchal structures. Actually, the legislation was very much one based on male dominance over women. And so you had this very interesting space where an increasing proportion of Emirati women could enter the public sphere.
That's because the government
allowed it to happen, but still very, very traditional legislation and still under male guardianship when it came to the private sphere, even in terms of the public sphere. I mean, yes, you could work, but it would have been impossible for an Emirati woman to work if their male guardian had not given permission to.
Right.
Even if legally it was not a requirement, it would at least socially,
in practice
it would be. But at the same time, it was interesting because these women who started to enter the public sphere, the fact that they started occupying that space gives them or allow them to raise, within the frame and constraint of the UAE, a voice to negotiate more spaces within the private. So, I mean, it is quite interesting, the UAE and how it's evolving and I think, I think women in the UAE will increasingly negotiate more space, irrespective of the position of the government, because it's, in a way, what derives from the fact that you start having an income, you're educated, you're more empowered, and so you have more confidence in negotiating greater spaces.
Yeah, and in a way, you'd feel that, yes, coming from a Western culture, you might find that very difficult to come to terms with, but at the same time, these are the baby steps that perhaps are required in order to pave the way for greater change as well.
Yeah, and we have to remember that the UAE is a country 40 years ago, it was just tribal settlements. Yeah. And it took hundreds of years for Europe to get where we're at. The UAE, it is a traditional society because 40 years ago, that traditional society was what was holding these people together. So I think it's always important to take a step back and say, okay, there's a reason why it is the way it is,
and to contextualize things as well. But I've never been there, but that's what I heard. I lived in Dubai for 6 months back in 2007. I recall at the time, Dubai was already quite developed, but whenever we spoke about Saudi, we said that if you go to Saudi as a woman, you have to be, completely dressed up in their traditional garment, etc. But nowadays, it's completely changed, and I would have never thought that back in 2007. So women have started at work, entering the workplace, etc. So I think, even in those societies where you think that actually there's still a lot of work to be done in gender economics, things are moving, albeit a baby and space. And how about Mauritius then, when you came here?
Actually, interestingly, and even though you don't have state-sponsored feminism in Mauritius, but it's not so different from the UAE. I mean, Mauritius has done much more in terms of legislation. There's no doubt about that. In terms of access to education, access to health, and in terms of the labor market. But in terms of
culturally
patriarchal structures, little has changed in Mauritius, and so it's not the same traditions as in the UAE. They're different, but still they're there. And I think in the private sphere, I think things are still, there's still a long way to go for Mauritius to build a society that is truly fair on gender grounds. We have to put it into context. I mean, what Mauritius has achieved in the last 50 years on the gender front is extraordinary. And interestingly, the UAE actually has a better performance overall on the gender front, but that's because of the expatriate population.
Sure.
Only 10% of the Emirates population are Emiratis, 90% are expatriates. So the data is a bit skewed. The reality of being an Emirati woman is very different from the reality of the different types of expatriate population we have. Mauritius is 101th on the gender gap index in the world out of 140 countries. So we're quite low, actually.
Wow.
And so that's measured in terms of economic participation, health, decision making, and I think legislation. And in terms of health and education, we're doing really well, but in terms of economic opportunities and decision making, we're actually quite behind. We're behind a lot of sub-Saharan African countries as well. So we still have a bit of a way to go.
Let's put aside the public for now in terms of legislation, because as you said, the legislation is not bad, but in the private sphere, what do you think as a society we should be doing better?
Just to come back in terms of legislation, I mean, it's great to have laws, but it's even better if we can enforce them. As you probably know better than me. And I think we do have a lot more to do in terms of our ability to enforce the laws that are in place in Mauritius. In terms of what can be done, at least in terms of economic opportunities, because Mauritius is a country that, was very much built, of course, with the support of, a government overview, but very much built by the private sector. There is a huge role for the private sector to play in transforming Mauritian society along these lines. Private corporations should not underestimate the influence they have on society. If you can initiate change within your organization, all these employees are going to go home and they're going to talk about these changes, and that means that you can have changes within the household. So I do think there is a great responsibility on private corporation, the private sector, and organizations in general to initiate change within their walls, because the workplace is a great carrier of discriminatory processes, explicit and implicit, and we can start here. I mean, the government has its responsibility on a lot of other fronts, and the whole conversation that happened there, but there are things that are within the power of private corporations to reestablish a balance and a fairer society for both men and women.
I appreciate this is a slightly controversial question, but do you believe in positive discrimination?
Positive discrimination is always a term that is, so I'm not going to use that term. Okay. But I certainly believe that no organization can say that they're taking this topic seriously if they don't have targets, and that's for sure. I mean, you would never do it for any other strategy. If as an organization you have a strategy, I don't know, to your bank, and you want to reduce the number of cash transactions, you're going to put a target. Okay, we want to be at that percentage of cash transaction by 2024. Well, it's the same thing for gender. If you want to have more women in middle, senior, or leadership executive positions, you have to set a target. If you want to minimize the case of sexual harassment within your organization, you have to set a target, and you will not achieve anything unless you have a target. You need to have something to work toward to, and you need to have something to hold your leaders accountable to. And if you don't have anything that you can measure, then you can aspire to, it's not going to work. Now, the question of quotas, the research is interesting. What the research says is that quotas work if you have the buy-in of the organization, but it won't work if you don't have the buy-in of the people within the organization. And so I do think that if we want things to move faster, you will need quotas. Otherwise, it's going to take 100 years to get where we want to be. But I think if there's an organization that feels that the conversations have taken place, that the subject has been normalized within the organization, where there is a buy-in of most people around the question of building a more gender equal organization, then quotas can and will be very effective, because there will no longer be this issue of perception that a woman has been selected just because she's a woman. There will be an understanding that even with quotas, you will actually allow an injustice to be repaired. Because what is happening at the moment is we have a lot of men who are benefiting from positive discrimination through unconscious bias, and who are getting promoted even though they don't actually, not necessarily the best person for the job. So in theory, yes, I think quotas are important, but I understand that it's not possible in any kind of context, that you have to have the right context to establish it. But fine, you don't want to put quotas, it's perfectly fine.
At least
but set a target.
Yeah. And that would, as you said, make the distinction between people who are just there to tick the box, as opposed to you have the genuine willingness and the buy-in. Which brings me to my next question. I think you've done a lot of talks recently about unconscious bias, a lot of trainings across organizations, across Mauritius. What's your general feel in terms of, est-ce qu'il y a la volonté de faire changer les choses, or do you feel it's just that, okay, I have an ESG strategy and I have a box to tick?
I think it's very early to say for Mauritius, because only a very few organizations have embarked on this journey. I mean, there's some, it's difficult. Those who are international organizations, it's very different. But, Mauritian Mauritian, organizations. It's very new. They've really initiated these in the last 2 or 3 years. Those that with whom I have interacted, I think there's a sincere intent, and the motivation might be a business imperative. I mean, the realization that actually you will improve your talent pool if you have fairer processes. But also, I think there is an element of social justice in there. I mean, in terms of their impact on community. I think Mauritian corporations, more than another country, do feel, and I may be wrong, but actually have a more sense of responsibility towards the nation, towards nation building than in other countries, maybe because it's small, because the history is young in terms of since independence. And so I do feel that there is these two elements. But whether this is a tick boxing is it very early, maybe I'm naive, but I think most organizations start with the right intention. But it's when things get difficult that it becomes a tick boxing exercise. When you start having the backlash, you do it at senior, and the senior you have the buying of your senior leadership, and it's looking, relatively good. It's when you start, trickling down with all your middle managers, and some of these middle managers start feeling, well, she's, now you're discriminating against men, and she just got the position because she's a woman, and you start having all that backlash. Yeah. And if you're not prepared as an organization to manage, to communicate, this is when you might just say, oh, well, let's wait a minute, let's slow down. And then it can just become, a lot of gender washing and tick boxing. But I can't say at the moment. I think most organizations are very early in their journey.
Probably just at the education phase. So they have to learn about it first. Like, for example, you taught a lot on and spoke a lot about unconscious bias. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, so that some of the more common examples of, because I think sometimes it might come as a surprise to some people that a particular type of behavior is actually unconscious bias.
And also I think what's difficult is that because it's implicit, because it's hidden, and often it's small things, it's difficult to understand that it's the accumulation of these small things that lead to actually the most perversive discriminatory processes. And it came about actually because we found that explicit discrimination, so open discrimination, I'm not going to hire you because you're pregnant, for example. Because of legislation, these were actually reducing, but discriminatory process was still there. So that's how social science started looking at implicit bias and unconscious bias, second generation bias. So there's so many different words to name it. I think for Mauritius, there these three, which I think were particularly at play, and which we found when we were working with organization. One is what we call the performance bias. And so what a lot of study have shown is that we tend to overestimate male performance and underestimate the performance of women. And the reason behind are complex, but what happened is that when we make decision around a promotion or hiring, we tend to, or giving a big important project, we tend to base it for men on their potential. But when it comes to women, we actually make sure that they have ticked all the boxes of the requirement of what we think is needed to actually get that position or get that promotion or get that big projects. And so that means that it's much easier for men to get and to go up the ladder. And that's linked to also the fact that what we call attribution bias is that we have a tendency to value male attributes more than we value female attributes. So being confident, being assertive, being a go-getter, we're going to value that. These types of personalities, behaviors are going to be more visible and are going to be rewarded more. Well, behaviors such as empathy or collegiality, even though these are very important behaviors for leadership, they're not valued as much. They tend to be undervalued in the workplace. And so women, because of the way we're socially conditioned, we tend to be more empathic and collegial and much less go-getters and assertive.
Or sometimes they would just call the woman as aggressive as opposed to being confident.
And exactly, and that leads to what we call walking the tightrope for women. Because if we're too masculine, we're penalized because we're expected to be feminine. But if we're too feminine, we're not exhibiting the attributes that are valued within the organization. And that it's something that, through our conversation with organization and through a course, certainly is at play in Mauritius. The in-group preferences also, it's very much at play. The fact that you will have a tendency to relate to those who look like you. And so, if you're a man, well, of course, it's going to be easier for you to relate with people who are men like you or the same social class or the same, it works for any social group categories that you can imagine. And that becomes, a conduit for discrimination. And in an organization where you have a majority of men at the leadership, that has huge implication on women's visibility and their ability to be seen, move up the ladder within an organization. And that, has knock-on effect in terms of the way we network. We tend to network with people we get along, so we're going to go golfing with the boys. Yes. And another bias, of course, in Mauritius is the maternity bias, the maternal bias. The fact that, of course, because of the social expectation, we tend to be the main carers, and we carry that triple burden of looking after the family, the community, and work. But also it has implication in terms of how we're perceived at work. So, for example, someone will say, "Okay, I've got this big project. Oh, maybe I'll give it to Joanne. Oh no, but Joanne just had a baby. Maybe it's going to be too much for her. I'm not going to give it to Joanne." Well, nobody asked you.
So I made a value judgment based on my bias, and
and without even asking you whether maybe you want to take the baby in the project. You want to, and so a lot of that is also happening within an organization. We're making assumptions about others' preferences based on stereotypical views of what other roles of norms and etc. And there are many more, but these are some which we found manifesting itself in Mauritian organization. Social tasks. The fact that women are often assigned social stack within the organization. So this is how you bring the patriarchy within the organization. So when there's an event to organize, the women have to organize it. When you're busy organizing teacups and cakes, you're not actually working on the big projects that are going to give you the promotion for the next. So all these times, these little gestures are feeding a climate and processes that are more discriminatory against women, or other social group minorities can also suffer from these kind of processes.
Yeah. What I find more insidious as well, or as insidious, is that those type of kind of daily microaggressions or micro behaviors feed into making women biased against other women as well. And I just find that quite dangerous as well. I mean, in the context in which we evolve as lawyers, I'd find myself in a transaction where I'd have a competent woman colleague dealing with something. Difficult client comes in, woman client, give them help. Once the male colleague interferes, sheep-like behavior, which I find, I would not expect that from her, but it wouldn't greatly surprise me that coming from a man. But even the woman also has an unconscious bias, and all these kind of societal conditioning has fed into themselves being biased against other women and expecting the men to be better.
But that's because we're all socially conditioned in similar ways. And so, yes, as women, we're as much carriers of these biases as men. And unless, we've educated ourselves, and unless we try to better understand our behaviors and how our behaviors or these microaggressions affect others, we will continue to perpetuate. And I think it's very important, actually, what you brought out, is that we are all carriers of these biases. This is not something that men do or women do. We all do it. And that's what we all need to better understand and, and check your bias, kind of, I think, which was one of those international women, it was check your bias, or something like that. But it is actually very important. You need that introspection, because even, I'm a gender specialist, but even myself, I do it. I catch myself saying things or doing things that are clearly the result of the way I was socially conditioned as a child, as a young woman, and now as a less young woman. And so, yes, I'm not surprised. And I think it leads me to something else, which is often used, and I often hear it, is that, women often fight in the workplace and they can't work together and they're in competition. But I think, for me, this is actually a manifestation of the discriminative process. A woman wouldn't do that if there was no scarcity of roles for women.
If they didn't feel they had to compete against each other.
I mean, if it was a level playing field, we wouldn't have that issue. This is not specifically female behavior. It's a behavior which is a result of a very competitive field, because there are very few spaces for women. And we're all there, looking for the male attention, because the male is those who are at the top, and
decision makers.
So, yeah.
Right. That's an interesting angle to it as well. Never thought of it like that. So in terms of, you mentioned about the setting the targets, which I think is a very important tool or objective. In terms of practical tools, a company who's now starting to look at educating its employees, its stakeholders, what sort of practical tools do you think they could set in place to sort of try to chip away at this unconscious bias?
I think when you're working as an organization to initiate some kind of gender strategy, there are two levels. There's the individual level and the organization level. And at the individual level, it's really establishing this conversation within your organization And for each and every one of us to educate ourselves, understand how this process manifests itself, check your bias, understand what structures are. And of course, organization can help by training their staff, but also creating spaces for conversation around these themes, by supporting. It can be a difficult process because you're touching upon topics that are related to culture, to behaviors at home. And so you actually need to create safe spaces for these conversations to take place. But then at the organizational level, we talked about target, but you really need to start at the top. You start at the top, and you need to have that buy-in from your executive and senior leadership. Without that, nothing else is going to happen. So train your senior leadership, your executive leadership, not just one day. Have structures, have a gender diversity and inclusion committee, have that committee work with your senior leadership so that senior leadership can take ownership of the change, and that it becomes something that they will actually lead in the same way that they will lead any other financial targets. Once you have that, you can start trickling it down. But until you have that, there's no point trickling it down. It has to be carried.
Come from the top, yes.
With intent. Intentional leadership towards that change has to be there before you trickle it down. It's a messy process. I mean, we have tons of tools that are there, that organization, and we know some of the tools that work, but it's not like you can just give a kit and it will work in any context. But because each organization have different cultures, different histories, different structures, there is a bit of a trial and error for each organization to find what works for them. But certainly having a committee, training your staff, having spaces that allow to support women to overcome their barriers, so women in leadership program, for example, but being clear that the responsibility is not on women, but on the organization for change, finding allies within the organization, men and women who are willing to carry the change, but also find space for those who are not allies. And so in one of the research we've just done, we pulled out different profiles that you would find in terms of behaviors when such a change is taking place. But whatever your profile, even if you're an antagonist, really traditionalist, there's a space for these people to be part of the change. And as an organization, you need to be able to identify
at least hear, even though you may not agree with it, to hear their point of view and see, well, how can we not work around that, but how can we, well, I don't know, maybe eventually change their mindset through hearing them out or them feeling heard?
Yes, exactly. But it also, what you will find is that you might be an antagonist, but you really care about fair processes. And so there might be actually things that you implement in the context of a gender transformation that person really relates to, because it's fair, it works. For example, blind CVs. Clearly that's a fair process.
Nothing to do with
nothing to do with women. It's about being fair, and so they will carry that. Also, absolutely essential. You need to know what are the discriminatory processes that play within your organization. You need to do an audit. You need to measure. You need to hold people accountable. You need to monitor. And often this is where many organizations lacks a bit, because it's a lot of work, it's resource costly,
and it's not bringing in the
P&L
immediately.
No, it's not.
Yes.
And that's the other thing. You see the benefits, but in 5-10 years time, you won't see it now. So often they ask me, how are we going to measure whether or not we're going to make more profit? And I understand,
Sure,
these
at
are
the end of the
private
day, it's there
corporations.
to make a profit.
And it's very difficult to measure, and they won't be able to see it immediately, even though evidence is very clear on that. I mean, the evidence is actually quite unanimous on the fact that greater diversity does increase financial performance and increase productivity. So, the evidence is there, but that does not mean that you will see it very immediately when you initiate a change.
And last question for you, Myriam. So we've spoken a bit about the kind of the organizational sphere, what can we change? In terms of government and legislation, if you had a wish list for this year's budget in terms of, it doesn't need to be budget, but I know that's the next piece of big legislation coming in. What's one legislative change that you would bring that you think would help with the gender issue?
So it's hard.
You probably have a whole list.
I love it. And actually, Mauritius is quite, and I think a lot of it is more in terms of implementation.
Sure.
I think...
Would you introduce parental leave, although maybe our society isn't quite ready for that yet?
I think there are two big issues. For example, in other countries, maternity leave, the government bears part of the cost. It's not just the private sector. And I think this is leading to a lot of discriminatory practices in Mauritius because it is a cost for an organization, and that cost is not shared by society, by the government, what I mean by society. And so I think on that, there might be a space for the government to rethink so that, there is a shared, the cost of maternity parental leave is shared. And certainly I'm very much in favor in parental leave, even though it is not a magic bullet, because there's still, men can be penalized for taking parental leave within an organization for the same reason, based on gender bias. So it's not a magic bullet. It's not because you have a parental leave that suddenly all the men are going to start taking parental leave for a year and look after the children so that the woman can continue her career. But it's certainly a step in the right direction, and it's also sending the right signal in terms of challenging gender norms within the household. I think something else, because I do think it's a big problem in Mauritius, is a gender pay gap. I do have a dream that the Mauritian government imposes big organization to be transparent on pay, because the gender pay gap is particularly acute in the private sector. It's on average, for Mauritian nationally, for every 100 rupee made by men, women make 76 rupee. And 88% of the gender pay gap, according to the World Bank, it's not an exact study, but according to the World Bank, 88% of that pay gap cannot be explained by differences in education, years of experience. So that means that there are a lot of discriminatory processes in terms of the difference in pay in Mauritius. And that, for me, especially in a society where salaries are already quite low, where women bear a lot of the responsibility for financing the education and the reproduction of the family unit. Other studies that show women invest more of their income into the production of the family. Being able to correct that gender pay gap is I think, is a priority, and forcing organizations to be transparent about it. It's not not a magic bullet as well, but at least it puts them in front of their responsibility and forces them to be public about it. And in a small society like Mauritius, I think it can be quite effective.
I agree, and also, as you said, it's not about the legislation, because the legislation is clear that equal work, equal pay. But on the implementation of it, how do you actually prove it unless there's accountability through transparency? Okay, so the wish list is noted, and hopefully, whoever's listening to us will take that into account. Thank you so much for your time, Myriam, and the tremendous job that you're doing. Hopefully, you'll pave the way for more education around, the many private organizations in Mauritius around the gender, I wouldn't say problem, but issue, challenge.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. I was so happy to be here.
Thank you again.